Welcome to episode 42 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time we're going to talk about Max Roach's 1960 album, We Insist, Freedom Now Suite. So what to expect from this album? It's a jazz album, 1960. It's got some avant-garde pieces, although not nearly as avant-garde would get in later in the decade. It is fundamentally concerned with the civil rights movement. It's basically it's a completely conceptual album all the way through. All the different tracks work along different parts of a theme of sort of the history of black music and oppression, liberation, and so on. It incorporates a bunch of different trends that were popular in jazz in the '60s. Ditching the piano, for instance, and just going with leaning much more heavily on percussion and bass. Introduction of screaming vocals, which was pretty controversial, not just for audiences, but actually for the creative team behind the album themselves, and also you have collective improvisation, which the kind of thing which Ornette Coleman was experimenting with and others at the time you have here as well. So it is in many ways a very forward-looking album and an album full of risk-taking, which of course makes it exciting. Max Roach, of course, had played on Sonny Rollins' 1958 Freedom Suite, so he was no stranger to jazz as a vehicle for political and social protest. And in 1959, he and a lyricist called Oscar Brown Jr. had begun to work on a kind of a unified suite, which they had planned to premiere the centenary of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1963. What happens, of course, is events are moving very rapidly. The Little Rock situation, the Greensboro sit-ins, and all the things that had been happening all the way through the 1950s and in the early 60s. These kind of steer them much more rapidly to creating the Freedom Now Suite in 1960. While Brown and Roach is handling the music, Brown's handling the lyrics, and they're in different cities, and they're phoning each other, they're composing this album over the phone. They begin to disagree about much, in kind of a microcosm of the civil rights movement itself. They begin to disagree over tactics and how they, what they wanted the album to say, what they wanted the lyrics to say, how it was going to end. And although it's not as simple as this, and I'm oversimplifying here, much in the way that the followers of Martin Luther King and the followers of Malcolm X didn't necessarily disagree about what was happening to black Americans, but disagreed fairly fundamentally on the tactic to deal with it, on the eventual solutions. So that dispute about really between moderation or revolution in response, collaboration or revolution in response, that disagreement finds its way into these two composers' discussions, and eventually they argue so much that they cease to progress in it, and Brown basically metaphorically walks off. Roach keeps the project alive, brings in Coleman Hawkins on sax and Abbey Lincoln to sing, and takes it to Candid. And Nat Hentoff, who's a jazz critic but also a producer, created Candid Records at this point. Roach is one of his first signings. Brown didn't know the album had been cut, and certainly didn't know that some of the artistic choices that were made, like the screaming, had been done until Nat Hentoff writes to him and says, "Hey, can we have some information for the liner notes?" Anyway, he was displeased. So there are 5 pieces on this record, and they're all quite impactful in different ways. The first one, on side 1, is Drive a Man, which is as you may imagine is from the title, is a reflection on slave life, and it's done in 5/4, and what that does is allow an extra beat for a rim shot or a tambourine it varies different points in the song, which basically mimics the sound of a whip as people are working for 4 beats, and then there's the 5th beat is the whip. It sounds simple. It's actually very powerful when you hear it, and when you hear Abbey Lincoln singing. Abbey Lincoln, who was united with Max Roach for a while, but was, I think, no longer at this particular point. Um, this is and this song is also notable for Coleman Hawkins' work on sax and his solo, which is just terrific. Followed by Freedom Day, which is a riff on Emancipation Day of 1863. Of course, as mentioned, the centenary was coming up. This is a piece which ends up with a slightly unfinished feel, not least because Roach acknowledges this and says, we didn't act when we were doing this album. We don't know what it is to be free. So there is a kind of only a semi-complete sort of aspect to that particular piece. And then a really lovely song, I think, called Prayer, Protest, Peace, which of course contains some of the more dramatic pieces as well. The prayer movement begins with Abbey Lincoln doing this. She does this a few times in the record, this nonverbal singing, and it's so moving and so beautiful and so passionate. What she does, and she's only accompanied by Max Roach on the drums. It's a stunningly beautiful piece. Then we get into Protest, and a switch of feeling, and where Abby starts to scream. Then finally Peace, and you can actually hear the third movement. You can hear Lincoln emotionally and physically recovering from the strain of the screaming which had gone on before, as she gets back into singing and quavering at first, and then her voice slowly getting stronger. It's altogether, all three of these pieces, this triptych, are really amazingly powerful, and this whole first side of this album is I think incredible. Side two, the focus of the album switches more to Africa, and the first song is called All Africa. It's about the rich tradition of African music. It's a very positive song, and this is all about all the different sort of ethnicities and origins of music in Africa. Two notable pieces. First, it's Abbey Lincoln sort of repeating all the different names of different African ethnic groups and nations. The accompaniment is basically percussion, and it's led by Babatunde Olatunji, who's a Nigerian guy who in 1950, musician, was in Lagos reading Reader's Digest, of all things, and he sees that there is a scholarship available to Africans to go to the United States and study, sponsored by Reader's Digest. He applies, he gets a scholarship, and off he goes and establishes himself as a musician in the United States. He is discovered while drumming in a big ensemble performance by a guy called John Hammond, who was at Columbia Records, also the same guy who originally signed Aretha Franklin. Made a bit of a mess up of her career, but he signs Olatunji, and Olatunji ends up making a whole series of records, which are basically the first, so-called world music is, I think, a stupid term, but they are the first world music albums that Americans are exposed to, and basically starts that whole genre, at least in terms of the record industry. And he goes on to he was really close with Coltrane, with whom he founded this Center for African Culture in Harlem. He goes on to play with Cannonball Adderley, with Quincy Jones, Stevie Wonder. So a guy ends up with a heck of a career. Not bad for just applying in the Reader's Digest. Anyway, Abbey does this chanting, and there's all this great percussion. And then finally, Tears for Johannesburg. Again, this album comes out very shortly after the Sharpeville Massacre, horrific repression, violent repression and murder of a large number of people by South African forces, and peaceful protesters basically being mown down, which was kind of the genesis of the white Western world starting to be, shocked by the South African regime. It would take them another 25 or 30 years to be shocked enough to actually, to lend any support to the resistance there. But this is something which is highlighted by the musicians here, and you've got a nonverbal kind of vocal from Abbey Lincoln over some very gentle drumming, and then Booker Little comes in with this wonderful cameo of a solo on this particular track, and it's a really this song is a really rich, calm conclusion, mournful but calm conclusion to what has been an emotional ride through the whole album. My verdict for this album, 5 out of 5. I can think of few records which cover as many human emotions as this one does inside 40 minutes. It was conceived in emotion. It was nearly not made because of arguments between the creative team. It was shocking and influential in 1960, and it's still really moving today. Very, very powerful. And it has a wonderful, superb, multinational cast of musicians. So get it, listen to it. Highly recommend it.